The fiddle struck up a lively tune, just as Florence Graham realized she had made the biggest mistake of her life by coming to this dance. She stood against the rough-hewn wall of the community hall in Camp Verde, Arizona. Her hands clasped tight against the simple cotton dress she had sewn herself, watching the other young women being swept onto the dance floor by eager partners. It was September 1878, and the autumn air had finally brought relief from the brutal summer heat that baked this territory until everything seemed to shimmer like a mirage. Florence had walked 3 miles from the boarding house where she worked, hoping that maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. That maybe someone would see past the burn scars that twisted the left side of her face and neck, souvenirs from a cooking accident when she was 15. That had been 5 years ago, but the scars remained, angry and red, pulling at her skin when she smiled. "Look at her, standing there like she expects someone to ask her to dance," a voice said, just loud enough for Florence to hear. Margaret Whitmore stood in a cluster of girls near the refreshment table, her perfect blonde curls bouncing as she laughed. Poor thing. She should have stayed home and saved herself the embarrassment. Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks, the unmarred right side burning as hot as the scarred left. She turned slightly, pretending she had not heard, fixing her gaze on the musicians in the corner. The fiddler was joined by a man on the harmonica and another beating out rhythm on a washboard. Their music filled the hall, joyful and inviting, mocking her isolation. "I heard she has to work at that boarding house because no man would ever marry her," another girl said. Sarah Preston, the banker's daughter, spoke with the casual cruelty that came so easily to those who had never known hardship. "Can you imagine waking up to that face every morning?" The laughter that followed was like broken glass in Florence's ears. She had endured worse than this, she told herself. She had survived the fire. She had survived her mother's death from fever the following winter. She had survived being turned away from teaching positions because the school board thought her appearance would frighten the children. She could survive this. But surviving and living were two different things, and in that moment, Florence felt the difference acutely. She turned toward the door, ready to make the long walk back to town in the dark, ready to admit that hope was a luxury she could not afford. Then he walked through the door, and the entire room seemed to shift. He was not like the other men in the hall, the ranchers and store clerks and cowboys in their Sunday best. This man was pure wild, standing at least 6.5 feet tall with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the doorframe. His hair was dark brown, hanging past his shoulders in waves that suggested he had not seen a proper barber in months, maybe years. A thick beard covered his jaw, and his clothes were the practical buckskin and wool of someone who spent his days in the high country rather than in town. His arms were massive, muscles visible even through his shirt, and his hands looked like they could break a man in half without much effort. But it was his eyes that caught Florence. They were a startling blue, pale as mountain ice, and as they swept across the room, they held an intelligence and wariness that spoke of a man who had learned to read people the way others read books. The dancing faltered slightly as people noticed him. Dawson Yates was a legend in these parts, though few had actually seen him. He was a mountain man who trapped in the high country and only came to town a few times a year to trade his furs and stock up on supplies. Stories circulated about him, how he had killed a grizzly bear with just a knife, how he could track anything across bare rock, how he had lived alone in the wilderness for nearly 8 years. Florence had heard the stories, everyone had, but she had never expected to see him. Men like Dawson Yates did not come to town dances. His eyes continued their sweep of the room and then stopped. On her, Florence felt pinned by that gaze, unable to look away. His expression did not change, but something flickered in those pale blue eyes. Recognition, maybe, though they had never met. Or perhaps understanding, the way one wounded creature recognizes another. He started walking toward her, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and the crowd parted instinctively. Florence's heart hammered in her chest. Surely he was not coming to her. Surely he would veer off at the last moment, approach someone else, anyone else. But he did not veer. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Up close, he was even more imposing, all muscle and raw strength, smelling of pine and wood smoke and the clean scent of the mountains. "Miss," he said, and his voice was like distant thunder, deep and rumbling. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" Florence stared at him, certain she had misheard. Around them, conversation had stopped. The music played on, but she could feel every eye in the room on them. "I am sorry, what?" she managed to say. "I am asking you to dance," Dawson said. His eyes never left hers, never once drifted to the scars on her face. "If you are willing." Behind her, she heard Margaret Whitmore's sharp intake of breath, heard Sarah Preston whisper something that might have been disbelief or outrage. But none of that mattered, because this man, this mountain of a man, was looking at her like she was the only person in the room. "I would like that," Florence said, and her voice only shook a little. Dawson extended his hand and Florence placed hers in it. His palm was calloused and warm, completely engulfing her smaller hand, and he led her onto the dance floor with surprising gentleness. The other dancers made room, creating a space for them, and then the music swelled into a waltz. Florence had learned to dance from her mother, years ago when life was different, and her body remembered the steps. But she had never danced with anyone like Dawson. Despite his size, he moved with the grace of someone completely comfortable in his own body, leading her effortlessly across the floor. One of his hands rested lightly on her waist, the other holding hers, and Florence felt safer than she had in years. "They were being cruel to you," Dawson said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Those girls by the refreshment table." It was not a question. Florence looked up at him, surprised. "You heard them." "I hear most things," he said. "Spend enough time in the quiet, you learn to listen." His eyes finally, briefly, touched on the scars on her face. "They are fools. They see only surface. They miss what is underneath." Tears pricked at Florence's eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. "You do not know me." "I know enough," Dawson said. "I know you came here even though you knew it might be hard. That takes courage. I know you carry yourself with dignity even when others try to take it from you. That takes strength." He guided her through a turn, his hand steady at her waist. "And I know that you have kind eyes. That tells me more than any pretty face ever could." The music ended, but Dawson did not release her. Instead, he nodded to the musicians, who immediately launched into another tune. Around them, other couples returned to dancing, but Florence barely noticed them. "I do not even know your name," she said. "Dawson Yates," he said. "And you are Florence Graham." "Florence," he repeated, and the way he said her name carefully, like it mattered, made her breath catch. "That is a good name, suits you." They danced through that song and into the next. Florence lost track of time, lost track of everything except the steady presence of the man holding her, the warmth of his hand, the way he looked at her like she was precious. She had never felt precious before. When the third song ended, Dawson led her from the floor, but he did not abandon her to the wall. Instead, he guided her to the refreshment table where Margaret and Sarah stood with several other young women and men. "Ladies," Dawson said, his voice polite but with an edge of steel underneath. "Gentlemen." His eyes swept across them, that pale blue gaze sharp enough to cut. "I have spent most of my life in the mountains, away from what folks call civilization. But even I know that cruelty is a poor substitute for character, and beauty that is only skin deep is no beauty at all. Margaret's face flushed red, and Sarah looked like she had swallowed something bitter. The men with them shifted uncomfortably, nobody quite willing to meet Dawson's eyes. "Florence," Dawson said, turning back to her, "would you like some punch?" "Yes, thank you," Florence said, though her throat was so tight she was not sure she could swallow. Dawson ladled punch into 2 cups, handed one to her, and then stood beside her, a silent wall of protection and presence. The group at the refreshment table dispersed quickly, finding reasons to be elsewhere, and Florence felt something inside her chest loosen slightly. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," Dawson replied. "Cannot stand by while someone gets hurt, not in my nature." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, sipping their punch. The music had started again, a lively reel that had people clapping and stomping their feet. "Why did you come tonight?" Florence asked. "To the dance, I mean. I have heard you do not come to town often." Dawson was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the dancers. "I was restless," he said finally. "Been up in the high country for 3 months. Trap line did well, got more pelts than I expected. Came down to trade them and I heard music." He looked down at her. "Something pulled me here. Now I am glad it did." Florence's heart did something complicated in her chest. "Where is the high country? Where you trap?" "North of here, up in the mountains near the Mogollon Rim," Dawson said. "Got a cabin there, built it myself 6 years back. Good timber, fresh water, plenty of game. In winter, the snow gets deep enough to bury a horse, but I do not mind. The quiet suits me." "It sounds lonely," Florence said before she could stop herself. Dawson's expression shifted, something sad passing across his features. "It is," he admitted, "but I got used to being alone. Seemed safer that way." "Safer than what?" Florence asked. "Safer than caring," Dawson said. "Than letting people in. Folks have a way of leaving one way or another. Mountains do not leave. They stay put." Florence understood that kind of pain, the kind that made you wall yourself off from the world. "People left you, my wife," Dawson said, and his voice went rough. 8 years ago. We were homesteading down in the desert near Tucson. She got sick, fever that would not break. I rode for the doctor, but by the time we got back..." He stopped, his jaw working. "She was gone. I buried her under a cottonwood tree and walked away. Could not stay in that place anymore. Headed up into the mountains and just kept going." "I am so sorry," Florence said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "That must have been terrible." "It was," Dawson said, "but that was a long time ago. I am not the same man I was then." He looked at her again, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken. "Maybe it is time I stopped hiding in the mountains." Before Florence could respond, the music changed again, this time to a slower waltz. Dawson set down his cup and extended his hand once more. "Another dance?" "Yes," Florence said, not even pretending to hesitate this time. They returned to the floor, and Dawson pulled her closer than before, one hand firmly at her waist, the other cradling her hand against his chest. Florence could feel the solid beat of his heart through his shirt, steady and strong. She let herself relax into his hold, trusting him to guide her through the steps. "You dance well for someone who lives in the mountains," Florence said. "My mother taught me before she passed," Dawson said. "Said a man should know how to treat a lady proper, even if he chooses to live rough. She made sure my father and I learned." A small smile touched his lips, the first she had seen from him. "Feels good to remember that, to do something she would have liked." They danced through that song, and when it ended, Dawson did not let her go. They danced through the next one too, and the one after that. It became clear that he had no intention of asking anyone else, of letting anyone else ask Florence either. He held her close through every song, his presence a shield against the stares and whispers that followed them around the room. Florence had never felt so cherished, so protected, so seen. In Dawson's arms, the scars on her face did not matter. The cruel words did not matter. Nothing mattered except this moment, this impossible connection with a man who understood loneliness and pain, and the courage it took to keep living anyway. As the evening wore on, other people began to approach them during the brief breaks between songs. A rancher named Tom Willis shook Dawson's hand and welcomed him to town. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, smiled warmly at Florence and commented on how lovely she looked. Even Reverend Cooper stopped by to chat, clearly pleased to see Dawson among civilized company again. But it was the way Dawson introduced her that made Florence's heart sing. Not as someone he had taken pity on, but as my partner this evening, Miss Florence Graham, with a pride in his voice that suggested she was someone worth knowing. When the musicians announced the final song of the night, Florence felt a sharp pang of disappointment. She did not want this evening to end. She did not want to return to her small room at the boarding house, to the endless cycle of cooking and cleaning and trying to make herself invisible. Dawson must have sensed her mood because he held her even closer during that last dance, his hand warm and steady at her waist. "Florence," he said quietly, "I know this is forward and you can tell me no if you want, but I would like to see you again. Tomorrow, if you are willing." Hope flared in Florence's chest, bright and terrifying. "You want to see me again?" "I do," Dawson said firmly. "I want to know you better. I want to spend time with you, if that is something you would like too." "Yes," Florence said, the word tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. "Yes, I would like that very much. What time do you finish your work at the boarding house?" "I usually have Sunday afternoons free," Florence said. "Mrs. Patterson, the woman who runs it, is good about making sure I get some time to myself." "Then I will come by tomorrow afternoon," Dawson said. "We could take a walk, maybe have a meal together. I am staying at the hotel for a few days while I finish my business in town." The music ended, and the hall began to empty as people collected their things and headed out into the cool night air. Dawson kept his hand at Florence's elbow as they walked toward the door, a gesture that felt both protective and possessive in the best possible way. Outside, the stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any town lights. The air smelled of juniper and sage, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. "Which way is the boarding house?" Dawson asked. Florence pointed down the main street. "About half a mile that direction." "I will walk you home," Dawson said, as if there were no other possibility. They walked slowly through the quiet streets of Camp Verde, their footsteps echoing softly. Dawson matched his stride to hers, never rushing, his presence beside her solid and reassuring. They did not talk much, but the silence between them was comfortable, companionable when they reached the boarding house, a two-story structure with a wide porch and lamplight glowing in the windows. Florence turned to face him. "Thank you," she said. "For tonight, for the dances, for everything." "No need to thank me," Dawson said. "I should be thanking you. Tonight was the first time in 8 years I have felt like maybe there is more to life than just surviving." He reached out and gently, carefully, touched her face, his calloused fingers brushing the scarred side with the same tenderness he had shown the unmarred side. "You are beautiful, Florence Graham. Inside and out. Do not let anyone tell you different." Tears spilled down Florence's cheeks before she could stop them, but they were good tears, healing tears. "I will see you tomorrow," she asked. "Nothing could keep me away," Dawson promised. He waited until she was safely inside before turning and walking back toward the hotel, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. Florence climbed the stairs to her small room, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She changed into her nightgown and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, reliving every moment of the evening. The way Dawson had asked her to dance. The way he had held her. The way he had looked at her like she mattered. She barely slept that night, too excited and hopeful and terrified all at once. What if tomorrow he changed his mind? What if he had simply been kind in the moment but would think better of it come daylight? But when the afternoon arrived and Florence had finished her morning chores, Dawson was waiting on the porch of the boarding house, dressed in clean clothes with his hair tied back. He held his hat in his hands and smiled when he saw her. "Florence," he said, and that warm feeling bloomed in her chest again. "You came," she said, hating how surprised she sounded. "I told you I would," Dawson said simply. "I keep my word." They walked together through Camp Verde, and Dawson pointed out the places he remembered from years past, before he had retreated to the mountains. The blacksmith shop where he had his horse shod, the general store where he bought supplies, the creek where he used to fish as a young man passing through the territory. Florence told him about her life, about growing up in New Mexico territory until the accident, about losing her mother, about coming to Camp Verde 2 years ago because she had heard there was work. She told him about Mrs. Patterson, who was stern but fair, and about the other girls who worked at the boarding house, most of them as lost and alone as Florence herself. They found a shaded spot under a cottonwood tree near the creek and sat on the bank, watching the water flow past. Dawson had brought food from the hotel restaurant, simple fare of bread and cheese and apples, and they ate while the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves overhead. "Tell me about the mountains," Florence said. "What is it like up there?" Dawson's face softened as he talked about his cabin, describing the meadow where deer came to graze in the mornings, the stands of ponderosa pine that smelled like vanilla when the sun warmed them, the way the aspens turned gold in autumn and made the whole mountainside glow. He talked about the work of trapping, the long cold winters, the satisfaction of living by his own hands and wits. "It sounds wonderful," Florence said wistfully. "I have never been anywhere like that." "It is hard too," Dawson said honestly. "The winters are brutal, the work is backbreaking. And the loneliness." He trailed off, then looked at her. But maybe it would not be so lonely if there was someone to share it with. Florence's breath caught. "Dawson." "I know it is too soon to say such things," Dawson said. "I know we only just met. But Florence, I have lived alone for 8 years, and in one evening you made me feel more alive than I have in all that time. I cannot explain it, do not really understand it myself, but I know what I feel. And I would like to see where this goes if you are willing." Florence looked at this man, this gentle giant who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not dared to speak. She thought about the scars on her face, about all the reasons this could never work, about how different their lives were. Then she thought about how he had held her while they danced, about the way he looked at her, about the kindness and strength in his eyes. "I am willing," she said. Dawson's smile was like sunrise, transforming his whole face. He reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. They sat like that for a long time, watching the water and talking about everything and nothing, learning each other. Over the next week, they saw each other every day. Dawson extended his stay in town, finding excuses to delay his return to the mountains. They walked together, ate together, sat together in the evening while the town settled into sleep. He told her stories about his life, about growing up in Missouri and coming west as a young man, about the wife he had loved and lost, about the long years of solitude that had followed. Florence told him things she had never told anyone, about the pain of the accident, about the cruel comments and turned backs, about how she had learned to make herself small and invisible just to survive. With Dawson, she did not have to be small. He saw her, really saw her, and he liked what he saw. On the 8th day, Dawson took her hand as they walked along the creek and said, "I have to go back to the mountains soon. My supplies will not last forever, and I need to get ready for winter. But Florence, I do not want to leave you behind." Florence's heart clenched. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that these past days have been the best of my life," Dawson said. "I am saying that I cannot imagine going back to the way things were, living alone in that cabin without you. I am saying—" He stopped, turned to face her fully. "I am saying I am falling in love with you, and I want you to come with me." The world seemed to stop. Florence stared at him, unable to speak, unable to breathe. "I know it is a hard life," Dawson continued. "I know the cabin is rough and the winters are long, and it is not what most women would choose. But I would take care of you, Florence. I would protect you and provide for you, and cherish you every day of my life. You would never have to work at that boarding house again, never have to lower your eyes when cruel people say cruel things. It would be just us and the mountains and a life we built together." "Dawson," Florence whispered. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am," Dawson said. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a week, but I am 32 years old and I have lived enough to know what matters. You matter, Florence. You matter more than anything." Florence thought about Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, about the small room and the endless work, and the lonely years stretching ahead. She thought about Margaret Whitmore and Sarah Preston, and all the others who looked at her and saw only her scars. Then she thought about the mountains Dawson had described, about a cabin in a meadow where deer came to graze, about waking up every morning beside a man who loved her, truly loved her, not despite her scars, but because of everything she was. "Yes," she said, and laughed when Dawson swept her up in his arms, spinning her around like she weighed nothing. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 3 days later by Reverend Cooper in the small church at the edge of town. Florence wore the best dress she owned, a simple blue cotton she had made herself, and Dawson wore clean buckskins and a white shirt he had bought special for the occasion. Mrs. Patterson came to the ceremony, wiping away tears, and Tom Willis stood as witness along with Mr. Henderson from the general store. It was nothing like the grand weddings Florence had sometimes dreamed of as a girl, but it was perfect. When Dawson slipped a simple gold band onto her finger and kissed her gently, sweetly, Florence felt like her heart might burst from happiness. They spent that night in the hotel, Dawson as gentle and patient as he had been in everything else, making their first night together something beautiful and right. And in the morning, they loaded their supplies onto Dawson's pack horses and started the journey into the mountains. The trip took 3 days, following trails that grew steeper and narrower as they climbed. Dawson pointed out landmarks, showed Florence where to find water, taught her how to read the signs of weather in the sky and the behavior of animals. He was endlessly patient, never pushing her too hard, always making sure she was comfortable and safe. On the 3rd day, they crested a ridge and Dawson said, "There." Florence looked down into a valley that took her breath away. A meadow spread out below them, surrounded by towering pines and aspens just beginning to turn gold. A creek ran through the middle, crystal clear, and at the edge of the meadow sat a cabin made of logs, solid and sturdy with a stone chimney rising from one end. "Home," Dawson said, watching her face. "What do you think?" "It is beautiful," Florence breathed, and she meant it. They made their way down to the cabin, and Dawson helped Florence dismount before opening the door. Inside was one large room with a stone fireplace, a bed in one corner, a table and chairs in another, and shelves and storage along the walls. It was simple but well made, everything built by Dawson's own hands. "I know it is not much," Dawson said, suddenly uncertain. I can build more rooms, make it bigger, whatever you need." "It is perfect," Florence said, turning to him. "It is ours, and that makes it perfect." Relief flooded Dawson's face, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I will make you happy here," he promised. "I swear it." And he did. The months that followed were the happiest of Florence's life. Dawson taught her how to trap small game, how to cure hides, how to read the forest and live in harmony with it. He showed her which plants were good for medicine and which for food. He taught her to shoot a rifle, to fish in the creek, to preserve meat for the winter. In turn, Florence made the cabin a home. She sewed curtains from fabric Dawson brought back from a trip to town, planted a small garden that she protected from deer with a fence, organized the supplies, and made meals that had Dawson groaning with pleasure. She learned to make soap and candles, to tan hides properly, to do all the things a mountain woman needed to know. But more than the practical skills, they learned each other. They talked for hours in the evenings, sitting by the fire, sharing thoughts and dreams and fears. They made love in the big bed Dawson had built, learning each other's bodies with tenderness and passion. They laughed together, worked together, built a life together that felt rich and full despite its simplicity. When the first snow came in November, blanketing the valley in white, Florence stood at the cabin door and marveled at the beauty of it. Dawson came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. "Not a single one," Florence said, leaning back into his warmth. "This is everything I never knew I wanted. You are everything I never knew I needed," Dawson replied, turning her to face him. "I love you, Florence Yates." "I love you too," Florence said, and kissed him as snow fell softly around them. The winter was hard, as Dawson had warned. The snow piled high, and there were days when they could not leave the cabin. But inside, they were warm and safe and together. Dawson had laid in plenty of supplies, and between his hunting and Florence's careful rationing, they had more than enough to eat. In the long, dark evenings, Dawson carved things from wood, making Florence spoons and bowls and little figures of animals. Florence sewed, making clothes and blankets and telling Dawson stories from her childhood, the happy times before the accident. They read together from the 3 books Dawson owned, a Bible, a collection of poetry, and a novel about knights and ladies that had belonged to his mother. It was during one of those long winter evenings that Florence realized something that made her heart race. She had missed her monthly time, and her breasts felt tender, and she had been sick in the mornings for the past week. She waited until they were lying in bed, Dawson's arms around her, before she said, "I think I might be with child." Dawson went very still. Then he rolled over to look at her, his eyes wide in the dim firelight. "Are you sure?" "Not completely," Florence admitted, "but all the signs are there." Yes, I think I am." For a moment, Dawson just stared at her. Then his face broke into the widest smile Florence had ever seen, and he laughed, a sound of pure joy. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." He was so gentle with her after that, almost absurdly so, not letting her lift anything heavy or do any work he thought might be too strenuous. Florence found it both touching and exasperating, assuring him repeatedly that she was not made of glass, that women had been having babies since the dawn of time. But she loved how protective he was, how his hand would drift to her belly even before there was anything to see, how he talked to the baby in the evenings, telling stories about the mountains and promising to teach them everything he knew. Spring came slowly to the high country, the snow melting in patches, the creek running high with runoff. Florence's belly began to swell, and Dawson made the trip down to Camp Verde to stock up on extra supplies and talk to the doctor about what to expect. He came back with more food and fabric and medicine, and also with a small wooden cradle he had commissioned from the carpenter in town. "I could have made one," he admitted, "but I wanted it to be perfect, and Tom Willis does finer detail work than I can manage." The cradle was beautiful, smooth and carefully made, and Florence cried when she saw it. Her emotions were close to the surface these days, swinging wildly from tears to laughter, and Dawson handled it all with patience and love. Summer arrived, and Florence grew round and ungainly. She could no longer help with many of the outdoor chores, but she kept the cabin spotless and made sure Dawson was fed and cared for. He, in turn, doted on her, bringing her flowers from the meadow, making sure she was comfortable, rubbing her swollen feet in the evenings. In late August, the pains began. Florence had been hanging laundry to dry when the first contraction hit, stealing her breath. She made it back to the cabin and called for Dawson, who was splitting wood nearby. He came running, saw the look on her face, and understood immediately. "The baby." "Yes," Florence gasped as another pain gripped her. "The baby is coming." Dawson had prepared for this, reading everything the doctor had given him, but nothing had quite prepared him for the reality of watching his wife in labor. He helped her to the bed, brought her water, wiped her face with a cool cloth, and held her hand through each contraction. The labor lasted through the afternoon and into the evening, long hours of pain that had Florence crying out and gripping Dawson's hand hard enough to leave marks. But he never left her side, never showed anything but steady calm and support, even though Florence could see the fear in his eyes. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the cabin in golden light, Florence gave one last tremendous push, and their baby entered the world with a lusty cry. "A boy," Dawson said, his voice choked with emotion as he lifted the tiny squalling infant. "Florence, we have a son." He cleaned the baby carefully, following the instructions the doctor had given him, and then placed him in Florence's arms. She looked down at the red, wrinkled face, the tiny fists waving in the air, and felt a love so fierce it was almost frightening. "He is perfect," she whispered. "He is," Dawson agreed, sitting on the edge of the bed and putting his arm around both of them. "What should we call him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy, and Florence looked at her husband, this strong, gentle man who had given her everything. "Daniel," she said. "For your father, Daniel Yates." Dawson's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he found his voice, it was rough. "My father would have been honored, and he would have loved you." Baby Daniel was a good baby, fussy only when hungry or wet, and he seemed to thrive in the mountain air. Dawson was besotted with his son, holding him for hours, talking to him, showing him the view from the cabin door and promising to teach him all about the mountains when he was old enough. Florence recovered quickly from the birth, and life settled into a new rhythm. She learned to nurse the baby while also managing the household chores, to sleep in snatches when Daniel slept, to find joy in the tiny milestones like his first smile, and the way his eyes followed Dawson around the room. The fall came again, the aspens turning gold, and Dawson made another trip to town for winter supplies. He took Florence and Daniel with him this time, wanting to show off his family, and they stayed at the hotel for 2 nights. People's reactions to Florence had changed. She was no longer the scarred girl who worked at the boarding house, object of pity or scorn. She was Dawson Yates's wife, mother of his child, and people treated her with respect and even admiration. Mrs. Henderson cooed over the baby and gave Florence a beautiful quilt she had made. Reverend Cooper blessed Daniel and commented on how healthy and happy Florence looked. Even Margaret Whitmore, who Florence encountered on the street, seemed subdued. She glanced at Florence, at the baby in her arms, at Dawson standing protectively beside her, and mumbled a greeting before hurrying on. "Does it feel good?" Dawson asked as they walked back to the hotel. Seeing them realize they were wrong about you, Florence considered the question. A year ago, she would have desperately craved this validation, this proof that she was worthy. But now, with Dawson's hand warm in hers and Daniel sleeping peacefully in her arms, she found she did not care what those people thought. "It does not matter," she said honestly. "They do not matter. This, our family, our life, that is what matters." Dawson kissed her temple. "You are a wise woman, Florence Yates." They returned to the mountains and settled in for the winter. It was harder with a baby. More sleepless nights and more worries, but also richer in ways Florence could not have imagined. Watching Dawson with their son, seeing the gentle way he held Daniel, the way he sang to him in a surprisingly good voice, made Florence fall in love with her husband all over again. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons. Daniel grew from a baby to a toddler, taking his first steps in the cabin while snow fell outside, speaking his first word, which was Papa. Florence got pregnant again, and this time the labor was easier, producing a baby girl they named Delilah for Florence's mother. Dawson built an addition onto the cabin, making more room for their growing family. He taught Daniel to fish in the creek, to identify animal tracks, to move quietly through the forest. Florence taught both children their letters and numbers, determined that they would have the education she had valued. When Daniel was 5 and Delilah was 2, Florence discovered she was pregnant again. This baby, another boy they named David, came quickly and easily, arriving on a spring morning when the meadow was full of wildflowers. Life in the mountains was not always easy. There were harsh winters when supplies ran low, illnesses that frightened them, dangers from wild animals and unpredictable weather. But through it all, Dawson and Florence faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. Daniel turned out to be like his father, big and strong and quiet, happiest when he was outdoors. Delilah was fierce and clever, learning to read before her 4th birthday and constantly asking questions about everything. David was the sunny one, always laughing, charming everyone he met. When Daniel was 10, Dawson started teaching him how to trap, taking him on short trips into the mountains. Florence watched them go with pride and a little sadness, seeing her baby growing into a young man. But she still had Delilah and David to keep her busy, and when Dawson and Daniel returned, the cabin was full of stories and laughter. The children knew about Florence's scars, of course. They had asked about them when they were small, and Florence had told them the truth about the accident and the pain that had followed. She had expected them to react with pity or horror, but Daniel had simply said, "They make you look strong, Mama." And Delilah had kissed the scars and said, "I like them. They are part of you." On their 10th anniversary, Dawson surprised Florence by taking her back to Camp Verde while the children stayed with Tom Willis and his wife, who had become good friends over the years. They attended a dance at the community hall, the same place where they had met. The hall looked exactly the same, and as the fiddle struck up a tune, Dawson extended his hand just as he had a decade before. "Miss," he said with a small smile, "would you do me the honor of this dance?" Florence laughed and took his hand. "I would be delighted, sir." They danced just as they had that first night, but everything was different now. They were not strangers reaching out across loneliness, but partners who had built a life together, who knew each other's hearts and minds, who had weathered storms and celebrated joys side by side. "Do you remember that night?" Dawson asked as they moved across the floor. "When I first saw you, I remember thinking you were the most imposing man I had ever seen," Florence said, "and the kindest. I remember thinking you were the bravest woman in the room, Dawson replied. You had every reason to leave, to hide, but you stood there with your head high. And then when we danced, I remember thinking that I never wanted to let you go. You never did, Florence said softly. Never will, Dawson promised. They danced through song after song, just as they had that first night, holding each other close, and Florence thought about how one evening had changed everything. How one man's kindness had transformed her life from something she endured into something she celebrated. When they returned to the mountains and their children, Florence felt complete. This was her life, the one she had built with Dawson, and it was better than anything she could have imagined sitting against that wall in the community hall all those years ago. More years passed. Daniel grew tall and broad like his father and started courting a girl from Camp Verde, a sweet-natured rancher's daughter named Emma. Delilah showed no interest in marriage, preferring her books and her studies, talking about maybe becoming a teacher someday. David, at 12, was still young, still more boy than man. Florence's hair started showing threads of gray, and Dawson's beard went from brown to salt and pepper. But their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by years of partnership and tested by challenges overcome together. On a summer evening when Florence was 43 and Dawson was 51, they sat on the porch of the cabin watching the sun set over the mountains. The children were inside, Daniel and David playing checkers while Delilah read aloud to them. The sound of their voices drifted out through the open door, a peaceful domestic symphony. "You ever regret it?" Florence asked, taking Dawson's hand. "Giving up your solitude, taking on a wife and family?" Dawson looked at her, his blue eyes still as clear and sharp as they had been the night they met. "Every day I thank God that I walked into that dance hall," he said. "Before you, I was just surviving. You taught me how to live again. You gave me everything that matters." Florence leaned her head on his shoulder, fitting perfectly against his side after all these years. "You saved me," she said quietly. "That night when you asked me to dance, you saved me from a life of loneliness and shame. You made me see that I was worth loving." "You were always worth loving," Dawson said, kissing the top of her head. "I just helped you see what was already true." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky and the stars begin to emerge. From inside the cabin came a burst of laughter, David crowing about beating Daniel at checkers, Delilah's voice teasing them both. "We built something good here," Florence said. "We did," Dawson agreed. "And it all started with a dance." Florence smiled, remembering. The music, the way Dawson had looked at her, the feeling of his hand at her waist, the moment when everything had changed. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me, for choosing me." "Always," Dawson said. "Every day, every moment I choose you, I always will." The years continued to unfold in their gentle rhythm. Daniel married his Emma and built a cabin on the other side of the meadow, close enough for family but far enough for privacy. Their first child, a boy they named after Dawson, was born on a crisp October morning, making Florence and Dawson grandparents for the first time. Delilah eventually did become a teacher, taking a position in Camp Verde, and coming home to the mountains every summer to help with the garden and spend time with her family. She remained unmarried, content with her books and her students, though she had several suitors over the years who she turned down with kind firmness. David grew into a young man who loved the mountains as much as his father and brother, but who also had a gift for trading and business. He started accompanying Dawson on trips to town, selling their furs and negotiating prices, proving to have a sharp mind for commerce. Florence watched her children grow and thrive and knew that she and Dawson had done something right. They had raised good people, strong people, people who knew they were loved and valued. On their 20th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the cabin for a celebration. Daniel and Emma brought their 3 children. Delilah came from town, and David helped Florence cook enough food to feed everyone. They ate and laughed and told stories, the cabin full of the warmth and noise that Florence had once thought she would never have. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Florence and Dawson slipped outside to look at the stars. It was something they had done countless times over the years, stolen moments of quiet in the busy fullness of their lives. 20 years, Florence marveled. It feels like yesterday and forever all at once. Best 20 years of my life, Dawson said, pulling her close, and I am looking forward to the next 20. And the 20 after that, Florence added, and all the ones that follow, Dawson agreed. They stood together under the vast Montana sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first dance now watching over them as they celebrated 2 decades of marriage. Florence thought about the girl she had been, standing against that wall, trying to make herself invisible. She thought about the scars that had once defined her, but that now seemed like just another part of her story, neither shameful nor important. She thought about Dawson, who had seen past the scars to the woman underneath, who had chosen her and kept choosing her every single day, who had given her a life she loved, children she adored, a home in the mountains where she belonged. "I love you," she said, the words inadequate for everything she felt but the best she had. "I love you too," Dawson replied. "More than mountains, more than sky, more than anything in this world." Time moved on, as it always does. Florence and Dawson grew older, their hair turning completely white, their bodies moving a little slower but their minds and hearts still sharp and true. They watched their grandchildren grow, Daniel and Emma eventually having 6 children in total, a boisterous brood that filled the meadow with noise and laughter. Delilah remained in Camp Verde, but came home every chance she got, and Florence treasured the conversations they had, mother and daughter, sharing thoughts and dreams over cups of tea. David eventually married a girl from Prescott, a practical woman named Ruth who fit into the family like she had always been there. On a spring morning when Florence was 62, she woke to find Dawson already up, standing at the cabin door looking out at the meadow. She rose and joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Beautiful morning," she observed. "They all are," Dawson said. "Every morning I wake up next to you is beautiful," Florence smiled. After 42 years together, he could still make her heart flutter with words like that. "Flatterer." "Truth-teller," Dawson corrected. He turned to face her, his weathered face still handsome to her eyes, still the face she loved most in the world. "Florence Yates, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. Thank you for saying yes to that first dance. Thank you for saying yes to all the dances that followed." "It was the easiest yes I ever gave," Florence said, reaching up to touch his face. The beard was white now, but the eyes were the same, that pale blue that had captured her attention the first moment she saw him. They stood together in the doorway, watching the sun rise over the mountains, and Florence thought about the dance that had changed everything. The music and the movement and the moment when a lonely mountain man had asked a scarred girl to dance and had held her close through every song. She thought about how one act of kindness could ripple out through time, creating waves that touched not just 2 lives but many. Their children, their grandchildren, all of them existed because Dawson had walked into that community hall and chosen to see what others had missed. Love, Florence had learned, was not about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about showing up day after day, choosing your partner, building a life together one small decision at a time. It was about seeing someone truly and loving what you saw. It was about holding on through the hard times and celebrating the good times and remembering that you were in it together always. The years continued their march. Florence and Dawson celebrated their 50th anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, the cabin and the meadow filled with family. They were old now, their bodies worn by decades of hard work and mountain living, but they were still together, still in love, still partners in every way that mattered. On a quiet winter evening when Florence was 70, she and Dawson sat by the fire in the cabin they had shared for so many years. Outside, snow fell softly, blanketing the world in white. Inside, the fire crackled and the cabin was warm and cozy. "Read to me," Florence asked, handing Dawson the poetry book that had belonged to his mother. Dawson took the book, its pages worn soft from countless readings, and found one of their favorites. His voice, still deep but rougher now with age, filled the cabin as he read about love and time and the enduring nature of the human heart. Florence listened, her eyes on the fire, her hand in Dawson's, and felt perfectly content. This was enough. This had always been enough. A warm cabin, a good man, a life well lived. When Dawson finished reading, Florence said, "Do you remember that first dance? Really remember it? Every detail," Dawson said. "The way you looked standing against the wall trying to be brave. The way your hand felt in mine when we danced. The way I knew even then that you were special." "I was so scared," Florence admitted. "Scared that it was too good to be true. Scared that you would change your mind." "Never," Dawson said firmly. "From that first moment it was you, only you, always you." They sat in silence for a while, the fire burning low, and Florence felt the weight of years, of memories, of a life fully lived. She had been given something precious, something many people never found, and she had cherished it, honored it, every single day. More years passed, each one a gift. Florence's health began to fail first, her body worn out from decades of hard living and multiple childbirths. Dawson cared for her with the same gentleness he had always shown, helping her with tasks that had become difficult, making sure she was comfortable and warm. On a morning in early spring, when the snow was just beginning to melt and the first hints of green were showing in the meadow, Florence woke feeling peaceful and clear. She knew somehow that her time was close. Her body was tired, ready to rest. "Dawson," she said, and he was immediately at her side, taking her hand. "I am here," he said. "I am always here." "I know," Florence said, smiling at him. "You have always been here. That is one of the things I love most about you." She squeezed his hand weakly. "Thank you for everything. For the dance, for the life, for loving me." "It was my honor," Dawson said, his voice breaking. "Loving you was the easiest thing I ever did." "I am tired," Florence confessed. "So tired, Dawson." "I know, my love," Dawson said, tears running down his face into his white beard. "It is all right. You can rest. I will be all right. Promise me," Florence said urgently. "Promise me you will not hide away again, that you will stay with the family, that you will keep living." "I promise," Dawson said, though the words cost him everything. Florence smiled, satisfied. She looked at the face she had loved for more than 50 years, memorizing every line and angle. "Will you hold me?" she asked. "Like we are dancing." Dawson carefully climbed into the bed beside her, gathering her frail body into his arms, holding her close just as he had held her through countless dances over the decades. Florence rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "This is perfect," she whispered. "This is exactly right." And with Dawson's arms around her, held close and safe and loved, Florence Graham Yates closed her eyes for the last time. Dawson held her for a long time after she was gone, tears soaking into her white hair, his body shaking with grief. But even in his sorrow, he was grateful. Grateful for every moment they had shared, every dance, every laugh, Every sunrise watched together from the cabin door. He kept his promise to Florence. He did not retreat to the mountains, did not hide away in solitude. He stayed with family, spending time with his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandmother, making sure they knew how extraordinary she had been. Daniel and Emma took him in, and Dawson spent his final years in their cabin, still strong enough to help with small tasks, to teach the youngest grandchildren about the mountains, to pass on the knowledge Florence would have wanted preserved. On a summer evening 2 years after Florence's death, Dawson sat on Daniel's porch watching the sunset. His great-grandson, a boy of 6 also named Dawson, climbed into his lap. "Tell me about Grandma Florence," the boy demanded, as he often did. Dawson smiled, his arms around the child, and began the story he never tired of telling. "I saw her at a dance," he said. "She was standing against the wall and other people were being cruel to her, but I saw something they could not see. I saw her courage, her strength, her beautiful heart. So I asked her to dance. And she said yes," the boy chimed in, having heard this story many times. "She said yes," Dawson confirmed. "And we danced through every song that night. I held her close and I knew I never wanted to let her go, and I never did, not really. Even now, she is still with me, in my heart, in my memories, in all of you." The boy considered this solemnly. "Did you love her very much? More than anything in the world," Dawson said. "She was my partner, my best friend, the love of my life. And loving her, being loved by her, that was the greatest gift I ever received." The sun set in a blaze of color, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Dawson held his great-grandson and thought about Florence, about the dance that had changed everything, about the life they had built together in these mountains. He had been alone for so long before he met her, closed off and hiding from pain. She had opened him up again, taught him to hope, to love, to live fully. She had given him children and grandchildren and a legacy that would outlast them both. And it had all started with a dance, with music and movement and the simple courage to reach out to someone who needed kindness. With the decision to see what others missed, to value what others dismissed, to love without reservation, Dawson lived another year, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 89. His children buried him next to Florence in a quiet spot overlooking the meadow, under the pines and aspens they had both loved. The whole family gathered for the funeral, 3 generations strong, all of them products of the love that had begun at a dance 55 years before. Daniel stood at the grave with his siblings, looking at the 2 simple headstones. "They had something special," he said quietly, "something rare." "They did," Delilah agreed. "They saw each other, really saw each other, and they chose love every single day." "That is what they taught us," David added. "To see people truly, to be kind, to hold on to what matters." The family stood together as the sun set over the mountains, remembering Dawson and Florence, the mountain man and the scarred girl who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful. Their love story lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the values they had passed down, in the cabin in the meadow that still stood strong. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear music drifting across the valley, the sound of a fiddle playing a waltz, and the echo of laughter from 2 people dancing, held close, hearts beating in time, together forever in the mountains they had called home. The family kept the cabin, maintaining it as a place for gatherings and celebrations, a reminder of where they had come from. Daniel's great-great-grandson, visiting the cabin 100 years after that fateful dance, found an old journal Florence had kept, filled with her thoughts and memories. In it, she had written about that first night, about seeing Dawson walk through the door and feeling like her whole life had been leading to that moment. She had written about falling in love, about the fear and hope and joy of building a life with someone. She had written about their children, about watching them grow, about the satisfaction of a life well lived. And on the last page, written in a shaky hand during her final illness, were these words: "If I could go back to that girl standing against the wall at the dance, terrified and alone, I would tell her to hold on. I would tell her that kindness exists, that love is real, that life can surprise you in the most wonderful ways. I would tell her that a mountain man will walk through that door and he will see her, and he will ask her to dance, and if she says yes, if she is brave enough to take his hand, he will give her everything. A home, a family, a love that lasts beyond death itself. I would tell her that the scars do not matter, that they never mattered, that she is worthy of love just as she is. But most of all, I would tell her thank you. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for saying yes. Because that one dance, those few moments of courage, gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams. It gave me Dawson, and that was everything." The journal became a family treasure, passed down through generations, a reminder of where they came from and the love that had started it all. And in Camp Verde, in the old community hall that still stood after more than a century, there was a plaque that read, "In memory of Dawson and Florence Yates, who proved that love sees beyond the surface and that one dance can change everything." Their story became legend in those parts, told and retold, inspiring others to look beyond the obvious, to see the worth in people that others might dismiss, to be brave enough to reach out even when it is hard. It reminded people that kindness matters, that love is powerful, that choosing to see someone truly and love them fully can create ripples that last for generations. And somewhere in whatever comes after this life, Dawson and Florence danced on, held close as always, their love eternal and unbreakable, a testament to the power of seeing and being seen, of choosing love over fear, of holding on to what matters through all the seasons of life. Their dance had ended in the physical world, but in the hearts of those who remembered them, in the family they had created, in the legacy of love they had left behind, the music played on, sweet and true and everlasting.